Good morning. Today is the first day of Shvat, Rosh Chodesh Shvat, the 11th of January, and we're up to the fifth reading of Parshat Va'era. Yesterday we talked a little bit, we tried to do it quickly, the whole parallel between the 10 plagues and our davening in the morning. So I did it so quickly that I didn't say the main thing. The main thing is that this is something that you can have in mind every day when you daven. It adds because all our ability to do anything depends on our mind. So the more the mind has something substantial to think about, the more influence things have. Because a lot of times people go through the davening and it's they understand some of it, they don't understand some of it, but when you have an idea that this is really affecting, there's a cumulative effect that goes over time. So today, so really what it means is you should commit it to memory, so that's why it's written down. You can remember what it is. And I think it's very beautiful. Many times I davened with this thinking in mind, and it really added another dimension to the impact of davening. Now we're up to the fifth reading. And the fifth reading, what we're going to do is, we've done this a few times, is that all the seven readings, they correspond to the sfirot from loving kindness to kingdom. I think the first time we did it was a couple of weeks ago. We'll probably do it a few more times because sometimes it's the best way to look at something. So here in the we're in the fifth reading. So the fifth reading corresponds to Hod. Hod has many translations because it has many meanings in Hebrew. It is the root of being a Jew. Yehudi comes from Hod. And the sages say that why is a Jew called a Jew? Why is it called a Yehudi? So simple reasons, because it comes from Shevet Yehuda, so it's like a Yehudi. But then it should have been a Yehudai. Really, it should have called it like that. But the idea of a Yehudi is someone who admits to Hashem, who acknowledges Hashem. So now what we'll see is, then in the fifth reading, we start with the removal of the frogs. The frogs started in the fourth reading. And now they're removed. And then we get the third plague, which is lice, kinim. So first of all, the connection between the frogs here is that they came in the fourth, they removed in the fifth, is to stress always the connection between the left and the right foot, which are the Hod and the Netzach. Netzach is the right foot and Hod is the left foot. And they work together. You can't walk with only one. But it also means, like we've discussed many times, and today we'll discuss a lot more, that there is what we call active confidence and passive confidence. That the right foot, when you say put your right foot first or forward, the idea is that you're going to be active. So the action is like bringing the frogs. And when you think about frogs, there's probably not very much that is more leggy than a frog. And when you think about frogs, it's exactly what you see. You see the long legs, and that's how. So it's very, very telling here that the frogs are brought on the fourth reading, which corresponds to Netzach. It's the active part of bringing it forward. And then removing it, taking it back, like the passive confidence, that's in our reading, in the fifth acknowledgement. Hod also means to acknowledge here in the sense that when you're passive, you acknowledge. When you're active, it's like you're going against what is in the world. So you're not acknowledging the world, you're rather trying to shift it, you're trying to change it. So acknowledgement is removing the things that you were active in and going backwards. It's one of the reasons why a Jew is called a Jew. Now that we're in the time of exile, it's called a Jew, and not, you maybe call him a Moshe, a son of Moshe, or there was such a thing in the time of the wilderness. They were called Bnei Moshe, the children of Moses, and these were considered to be the people that were most connected and devoted to Moses' way.
In Torah, they call him Jew.
They call him Jew. Yeah. So that's because we're more in a mode of acknowledgement, because in the exile it's much harder to be active. You can't really change things. And you see that whenever there's an attempt from the Jewish people now, founding a state, whether I agree with it, don't agree with it doesn't matter. The point is that Jews went and did something, so there's a lot of opposition. It's not the way that it's not. In the exile, you're more in the state of acknowledgement. You're more in the state of the left foot rather than the right foot. So, but there's another very interesting theme here with the new plague that's coming in. The fifth plague is called kinim. Kinim means lice. Kinim, for a strange reason, they come from the word kenut, which means honesty. And the inner aspect of hod is tmimut. It's called being earnest. Being earnest is literally being honest. So there's something about the kinim that they cause honesty. So I don't know if we would want to say that when children have lice, it means that they're more honest. Rather, what we want to say is like this, that this was the first time that the Egyptian magicians were able to acknowledge that this was the finger of God. They suddenly realized this they can't do. The blood they were able to duplicate. And the frogs, they were able to make more frogs. We know there's all kinds of explanations of how they were able to make more frogs. One of them is just that one frog came out, because it says Vatala tzfardea. Tzfardea is in the singular. So one frog came out of the Nile, and then they started hitting it, and little frogs came out. It's an interesting way of trying to say that in some way they were able to duplicate, they were able to mimic the same thing. But in any case, they felt that this was within the realm of their possibilities. It wasn't something that was so strange and different that they had to acknowledge that there's a different force at work here. But when the lice came, this they weren't able to do. Now the sages are very deeply discuss this. Why is it that Why is it that the lice were something so special? What was special about the lice that the Egyptians couldn't do? So they say that the thing with the lice is that they were so small. And this is a very interesting, we would say today that the lice were nanoparticles. Actually, even less than nanoparticles. Nanoparticles we know how to make. What we don't know how to manipulate is something even smaller, let's say a subatomic particle. There's a very important relationship between the left and the right when it comes to Netzach and Hod. They also correspond, I don't remember if we talked about this, but left and right are, first of all, the legs. The legs are the part that come out of the body. So that's the Netzach and Hod when you look outside. But there's also the inner parts of Netzach and Hod. What are the inner parts? So there's a few levels of what these inner parts are. The legs are the most external, so we call them actually the legs of the legs of Netzach v'Hod. More internally, we have the procreative organs, which also have a left and a right. Both in the male and the female, there's a left and a right, which in the male creates the sperm. So that would be the testicles. They're the left and the right. They're we'll call it the emotional part of Netzach and Hod. And above that we have the kidneys. And the kidneys also have a left and a right, and they're considered to be the intellectual side of Netzach v'Hod. How does this become intellectual? What's going on? So we say that, and again, this we'll talk about more today in the seminar, because this is a very important part of how you function, of how you learn how to function. The left and right kidneys are described in the Talmud as the two rabbis who taught the patriarchs, especially Abraham, how to act. They're not thinking in the sense of the mind. The mind thinks abstractly. They associate the kidneys with action. And that's very connected, because we said that it's protruding, it's coming out, it's something that's affecting the world. That's the lower sfirot. That's what they do. They're meant to affect the world. Except you can do it with active confidence and you can do it with passive confidence. Now, when they affect, there's two different aspects that they affect. The left and the right act differently. The right, like we said, is more active. The left is more passive. But the way that you really need to think about this is like this, that they create habits. They're not thinking, again, in the abstract sense, but there's something that you use to create habits. There's a very interesting book that I keep mentioning because I happen to have read it a while ago. It's called Atomic Habits. So atomic habits would be related It's a good question. Is it atomic? Is that the right still, or is it left already? But the principle is that when you go from the right to the left, you differentiate further and further. You get into more and more detail. I'll give you another example of this. When we talk about economics, for instance, we have a model called the Torah Academy, where Rav Ginsburg takes each one of the areas of knowledge and he associates it with one of the sfirot. So in economics is in Hod. It's an acknowledgement. It's in the fifth sfira. Why? So one of the explanations is that the economics has to take care of details of all the money supply. And money is a way of taking, let's say you have this building here. So this building could be worth, I don't know how you would say it without money. You would say, you couldn't say, you have to use numbers in order to give value. Otherwise you're working in quantum pieces that are too big for you. How would you trade a building for another building? You couldn't do it. You have to break it down to further. So the whole point of economics is to think about how do I break like a security, any kind of possession, any kind of thing that has value, how do I break it down into smaller and smaller pieces, and then I can work with it. And it's a big thing, just yesterday the first Bitcoin ETFs were approved by the SEC. So what are they doing? They're saying, until now, we treated this whole thing as sort of a blob. We didn't want to get into the details of it. We didn't want it to become part of the monetary system. The moment you bring it into the monetary system, you're actually really taking advantage of the fact that it can break things down into very, very small units. It needs a more discussion, but it also relates to how we act. Meaning, if you don't have money, if you don't have a value on something, it's very hard to know how to build your habits. For instance, a person says, I make such and such an amount every month. How do I break it down in terms of my expenses? Imagine that you didn't make it in a number, but rather you made it in some kind of lump piece of gold they'd give you. And now you have to somehow break the gold down. You couldn't do it. So in order to really build a habit, you have to break it down into smaller and smaller pieces. That's the premise behind this book, Atomic Habits, which is you change things slowly. And piece by piece, the more you do it in small pieces, the more impact you get. So here, the idea is that the Egyptians came and said, this type of thinking of creating habits we don't understand yet. We don't have that yet. And that was exactly what happened when they came out of Egypt. They received the Torah. The point of the Torah was to give a person, one of the points, not the only point, to give a person a structure for how he functions. So suddenly you break down the day. A lot of cultures do this, but they don't get down to the minuscule detail that the Torah wants you to get down to. Halacha keeps going further and further and further down. And we call it halacha, very interesting, other word for walking, which again has to do with the legs. And as you walk, you're creating habits, you get into more and more detail. The way that we see this in Jewish life, and we'll end with this, is that it creates what we call customs, minhagim. Customs are basically the development of halacha as people begin to do things. So they begin to ask, so how exactly do you do each thing? And when you begin to ask how exactly you do each thing, well, you may try to find a source in the Torah, but in the end, when you build a custom, what you've done is you've broken down the act even further. And as the generations go on, the actions become smaller and smaller and smaller. It used to be that all they did was they stood in front of Hashem, and they said, Hashem, good morning. That was it. That was all of Shachris. That was the whole thing. Slowly, they began to break it down until today we have something that's so complex and so intricate that comes from the level of Hod. That's like lice. That's what they symbolized. That the Egyptians couldn't understand this type of thinking. That there's a live structure that keeps getting more and more detailed. This was beyond them, and they had to admit is the finger of God, not the whole hand of God, just the finger. It's like a detail. And the last point is that Etzba Elokim, this phrase, finger of God equals 163, which is the value of, remember yesterday we talked about the Torah, I think this is the only place it mentions the age of prophets, and that Moshe is 80 and Aaron is 83. So 80 and 83 together is 163. So together, their age is equal to finger of God. It's like that this was the right time to introduce this whole concept in their lives. This was the right time to introduce this whole concept of beginning to break down habit in relationship to God. So we'll end with here. Chodesh Tov to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Tomorrow, I'll have to be an hour later because I'm going to the airport. I hope that by 7:15 I can sit down somewhere and we can.
We want to see you.
No, I have to leave at 5. Okay.